What's the one do-over you'd ask for? And if it isn't letting Lehman fail, why was that the right decision?
Okay. Well, so I thank you for the decision, for the question, because and I really do, because it's an interesting thing. Despite the fact that Ben Bernanke, Tim Geithner, and I have said over and over again, we couldn't find any legal step that we could have taken to save Lehman that would have worked. I think people continue to get the question, and people are skeptical of the question. And so I'll answer that question, and then I'll get to the to sort of the judgment mistakes or lessons learned or whatever for the crisis. Because that one of the things we learned, and Bob Steele was with me at the time with Bear Stearns, which was an investment bank. When it started to go down very quickly, one of the things we learned was there's no loan that would work. A loan from the Fed wouldn't work. They weren't going to make it through the weekend because they had, when an investment bank is in the middle of a run and is failing, what it takes is either a capital injection or a guarantee. And the Fed didn't have any power to do that. So it took J.P. Morgan coming in, filling the capital hole, guaranteeing the trading book. Then the Fed was able to assist that with a loan. So we went out of Bear Stearns weekend knowing that, having looked all around and found there were no emergency powers for dealing with failing investment banks. We had them for banks, but those authorities hadn't changed since the Great Depression. So really, weeks after that, Ben Bernanke and I went in and talked with Barney Frank, who was chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. And we told him what the problem was. We don't have emergency authorities to deal with a failing investment bank. And we got lucky because J.P. Morgan bought Lehman, bought Bear Stearns.
Yeah.
And but we're worried about Lehman, and we don't have the authorities. And Barney told us what we knew was true. He said, you have no chance of getting Congress to act unless you come in here and say that we're naked, we have no authorities to deal with a failing investment bank, and we think one like Lehman is apt to fail. In that case, it would have gone down the next day. And so that was, so we worked with that. Now, when Lehman was failing, we did everything we could to find a buyer. And if there was a buyer, the buyer could have been assisted for either the private sector or the Fed. We worked to get the private sector to assist that buyer. It turns out that the really only solid buyer was B of A, and they bought Merrill. And instead, and as I look back on it now, we tried very hard to get them to buy Lehman, but if they'd bought Lehman, then Merrill would have gone down because we had AIG, Merrill, and Lehman going down the same weekend. And it would have been worse if Merrill had gone down. And so, because they were bigger. And so, as I think back on the financial crisis, there are many lessons, but the do-overs I have were all communications. I never,
little close.
I was never ever able to have the American people understand that these bank rescues were not for the bankers, but they were to save our economy, to prevent disaster from occurring. It's very hard to get credit, though, for preventing a disaster people never saw. And then there were a fair number of other communications dilemmas. The judgment errors I made turned out, with 20/20 hindsight, to have been fortuitous, although they were judgment errors. When we went to Congress to get the TARP, although I wanted emergency authorities to put in capital in case you had to nationalize a bank or whatever, we said we were going to buy illiquid assets because these mortgage securities, which couldn't be valued and had losses, were the ones that were creating, the losses for the banks. But in the time we were up at Congress, the situation worsened. Before we had TARP pass and rolled out our programs, 6 European nations that had to bail out their banks. We'd had Wachovia and WAMU have these serious problems. And so we then changed and had a program which I think was incredibly successful, and it worked, it stabilized the system. It's turned a $46 billion profit for the bank and its insurance company capital program. But that was a judgment error. But if I had thought we had to inject capital, I would have gone forward and said we need that. And I'm not sure Congress would have voted for it. They voted it down the first time. It would have been more difficult for the House Republicans. Same with Fannie and Freddie. As they were literally on the brink. And frankly, I think the most consequential thing we did, which got the least attention, was Fannie Mae and Freddie back.
Nationalizing them.
Nationalizing it because they're 9 times bigger than Lehman. They're $5.4 trillion of securities spread around the U.S. and the rest of the world. They're issuing $20 billion in the market of debt almost every week. People are treating it like they're government securities, but there's no government guarantee. And when we went to Congress, I said, give us the authority, I really wanted unlimited. The people working with me said, you can't ask for unlimited authority, so we asked for unspecified. And And I defended it, and I really believe this. I defended it by saying, if people think you've got a squirt gun in your pocket, they'll make you take it out. But if they know you've got a bazooka, you may not have to take it out. Well, guess what? I was wrong. The market made us take the bazooka out. We nationalized them. I think because we did that before, can you just imagine what would have happened if we'd had a failed auction for Fannie and Freddie? And those securities lost value in all the financial institutions and around the world, and how that would have rippled through the
China
system.
was holding a lot of those.
Yeah, China, but forget about China.
Yeah.
Just think about the $3.4 trillion in all the community banks in the U.S. and in people's money market funds and all the other things, places where they were. It would have been disastrous. And then, of course, think of what happened to our housing markets if we hadn't had any mortgage market during the crisis. So, but again, if I'd gone to Congress and said, I think we have to nationalize Fannie and Freddie, I doubt they would have approved it. I didn't believe we would have to because the regulators said they were adequately capitalized. They said they were adequately capitalized. We didn't have anything but the public information. We got in there, found out the facts, and then we moved. And so again, those were judgments, but it's a bit about crisis decision making because when we were wrong, we changed. But one other major lesson, as I've been thinking about lessons, which tells you a little bit about how much we can rely on regulation. The first meeting I had with President Bush at Camp David in 2006, about a year ago, a little bit less, about 7 years ago. So July of 2007. I was asked to come in and talk about entitlement reform. And I asked if I could talk instead about a financial crisis. And I said, I think we might have a financial crisis coming, although I saw nothing like this. And he said, what would cause it? And I said, I don't know, sir, but after the fact, it'll be obvious because we've never been able to predict where some of these other crises have come from. And I talked about the derivative market, et cetera. I didn't see housing. And the reason I didn't see housing was because residential home prices in the U.S. had essentially gone up nationwide. There hadn't been a big nationwide decline ever since World War II because we had policies where we stimulated residential home buying, home ownership. If you owned a residential mortgage, the biggest risk wasn't that you wouldn't get your money back. The biggest risk was you'd get it back too soon because if rates dropped, home buyers would refinance. So I hadn't predicted that, but when we started working, and Bob Steele here was working with me with the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, we looked at every risk we could think of. We looked at hedge funds, we looked at the interconnectivity with big banks, we looked at derivatives. We never once looked at the shadow banking market. We never once looked at money market funds where there was a big risk, or the over-the-counter derivative market. Now I can blame that on the fact that we had this bifurcated, outmoded regulatory system. But another way of looking at it is if people that were really experienced, spent a lot of time in financial markets, a lot of smart regulators, weren't able to find the problems. I don't think we can ever count totally on regulators being able to uncover problems ahead of time.
Well, Hank, to conclude, I think that President Bush was right. You were trained and born for this crisis. And one thing we know, there will be another crisis down the road. And I think we can say safely that the Treasury Secretary, when that happens, is going to turn to his president and say, I want to be the Hank Paulson of this crisis, not the Andrew Mellon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.